Was Phil Leotardo a homosexual? According to one curious theory in the Sopranos universe, Lupertazzi's boss could have been gay or bisexual. What's more, Vito Spatafore may have known about it, for which he lost his life. I know it's hard to buy, but we're going to break it all down right now. At the have. You're watching Vano VHS. Every Sopranos fan knows how badly Phil hates Spatafore. We all remember the infamous scene where Leotardo executes the wayward mafioso by effectively coming out of the closet. Phil, and not, for example, Paulie or Silvio, who is after Vito. Let's also not forget that Spatafore's wife is a relative of Leotardo, and that just before the hunt begins, Spatafore is the guy that best gets along with Phil. After Phil finishes his business conversation with Tony, Vito takes Phil aside and says, "Hey, I need to get the number of the guy with cufflinks. I suggest we find out the alternative meanings of the word cufflinks. So, what do we have here? Aha! Handcuffs. Interesting coincidence, isn't it? Well, since you and I have decided to dig deeper, I suggest we take a closer look at Vito Spatafore's execution scene in the episode Cold Stone Guard when the last one arrives back at his motel suite. Whilst Vito is rolling around on the floor in terror, Jerry Torchiano switches on the lights. Before long, we observe the closet door at the other end of the suite burst open, and a flash later, Phil Leotardo comes out of it. The phrase, hiding in the closet, has been used since the 60s to refer to people who hide their non-traditional sexual orientation. This was due to the fact that the expression, hiding in the closet, is the opposite of coming out of the closet, usually shortened to coming out. The very thought of an influential person like Phil lurking in the closet is so preposterous that numerous fans of the series, including myself, are pretty certain that this is a subtle hint from the show's creators. Had it been necessary to stagger Vito, the screenwriters could have come up with many other choices. Regardless, they opted to use this particular one to demonstrate how Phil comes out of the closet, literally and metaphorically. Still, this does not mean that Phil has to lurk in the closet. Both Fat Dom and Jerry Torchiano are reasonably strong and can cope with Vito with the help of billiard sticks. However, it's not the closet which makes me wonder. This scene where Phil is gripping the bedsheet leads me to this. Watching closely, you can spot how strained Phil is. He sits on the bed, feet wide apart, eyeing the execution and his hand tightly gripping the mattress, illustrating his inner tension. Therefore, the camera focuses on this hand, underscoring its significance in this particular scene. Hence, in spite of the fact that there were several other possible ways to stun Vito, the filmmakers chose this one to highlight Phil's inner state and to illustrate his coming out of the closet. And even though he does not have to hide in the closet, the scene with the sheet and his straining hand helped to establish the atmosphere of strangeness and stress, the great importance of this moment in the development of the story. For 20 years, Phil has been locked up without women, and it is logical to assume that once or twice his little Philly takes a stroll into the backyard. Perhaps just at that moment, Phil found something in himself that he would later persist in hiding once he was released from prison. That sort of thing would help us all understand why Leotardo is so fanatical in his desire to eliminate Vito. In addition, there is a scene where Phil reflects on the compromises he had to make while incarcerated. He remarks, "I wanted a woman, and I settled for coming in a napkin." There is a significant pause before he mentions the napkin, almost as if he is attempting to dispel any notion that he engaged in sexual activity with other men while in jail. I find Phil's signature on Spatafore's corpse very revealing as well. When Vito's body is discovered, there is a billiard cue sticking out of his anus. Of course, all of this may suggest the indicative nature of the execution, as sometimes happens in the ranks of the mafia. For example, Sonny Black, who introduces Donnie Brasco to some authoritative members of Cosa Nostra, has his hands chopped off after death to set an example for others. However, the cue being in the wrong place can also have sexual overtones. Many maniacs, for example, have killed their victims while not sexually assaulting their victims. Nevertheless, the victims were found to have 50 or more stab wounds. The question is why so many? It turns out to be more complicated than that. In the sick imagination of those lunatics, the knife is a phallic symbol. I know it sounds crazy, but you can't take words out of a song. The morning after Spatafore's coming out, Phil drops by his house, at which point Lupertazzi's boss's attention is drawn to a TV screen featuring oiled-up musclemen. Phil throws a glance at the TV, then orders his man, "Turn it off!" Additionally, Phil expresses to Vito's spouse that he had a familial love for Spatafore. Abruptly, Spatafore's spouse breaks down in tears. Could she possibly have any suspicions? In any case, this marks the final occasion that Leotardo visits the Spatafore household. I would like to highlight another scene from the episode, Mr. and Mrs. John's Sacrimony Request. In this particular scene, Johnny Sack is overwhelmed with emotion at his daughter's wedding and is ultimately arrested by law enforcement. Then Phil, with other mobsters present, blatantly berates Johnny, saying, "It's a disgrace! I've lost respect for the man." Notice that nobody but Phil has a problem with John, though there are plenty of old-school mobsters at the wedding, for example, Paulie Gualtieri. And Phil uses his trademark word, disgrace, over and over again in relation to Spatafore. I think that by his actions, Philly is trying to compensate for his non-traditional identity, trying to appear like a real man in the eyes of his fellows. In support of Phil being a homosexual, another argument can be made. The final scene of the episode, Cold Stone. Phil is in bed next to his wife, but is unable to fall asleep. Although Phil has shown himself to be a tough man throughout the series, even by mob measures, Vito's assassination elicited a strong reaction from him that none of the previous wetbacks on his to-do list had. This might be interpreted as a sign that something is going on inside Leotardo. Perhaps he's recollecting his wife's comments about Vito going to hell for his quirks? Or perhaps he is self-reflecting and trying to come to peace with the fact that he murdered a human being who had the same tendencies as himself? Perhaps he has become aware of his sexual orientation and is trying to come to terms with that truth. Some may argue that Phil has a wife, a child, and even a mistress, so he cannot be gay or bisexual. However, this is not proof. And the promised ace in the sleeve, the question that Michael Imperioli asks David Chase during the Talking Sopranos podcast erases any doubts at all. Michael asks the series creator if Phil Leotardo is really gay, to which, without hesitation, Chase replies that yes, the closet scene was added to the show intentionally. This is a subtle hint, so to speak, a message to the Sopranos fans. David further adds that Leotardo is probably not fully aware of who he really is. But perhaps he partly guesses, nevertheless unwilling to face the truth. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to Vano VHS and hit the like button.